A handbag sits on a shelf in a market stall. It has the right logo, the right stitching pattern, the little metal clasp. It costs $60. 20 minutes away, in a glass display case in a department store, sits what is materially an almost identical object. Same basic leather, same general shape, same rough manufacturing cost. It costs $3,000. Neither price has very much to do with the bag itself, and that's actually the whole story hiding inside this topic, because counterfeiting isn't really a business built on copying objects, it's a business built on copying a story, the story a price tag tells about status, taste, and belonging, and selling that story at a steep discount to people the original story was never quite priced for in the first place. I want to talk about counterfeit goods today, because the standard framing that this is simple theft, people ripping off hard-working designers, isn't wrong exactly, but it skips over something much more interesting. Counterfeiting is one of the clearest possible windows into what we're actually paying for when we buy almost anything with a brand name on it, and why that price so rarely has much to do with the object sitting inside the box. Here's where the common story misses something important. We tend to think counterfeit goods exist because manufacturing has gotten cheap and unscrupulous factories decided to cash in. That's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't explain why counterfeiting concentrates so heavily around specific categories of goods, luxury fashion, watches, sneakers, rather than spreading evenly across every product category with a healthy profit margin. The real explanation requires understanding something economists call a Veblen good, named after the economist who first described it. For most products, demand goes down as price goes up. That's basic economics. But for a certain category of goods, mostly luxury items, demand can actually increase as price increases, because the price itself is the point. A watch that costs $50,000 isn't purchased primarily because it tells time more accurately than a $30 one. It's purchased because the price is doing a job that has nothing to do with timekeeping, broadcasting to anyone who recognizes it that the owner can afford something most people can't.
Once you understand that the price is the product, at least in part, counterfeiting stops looking like a strange, separate industry and starts looking like an almost inevitable response. If a huge portion of what you're buying is a signal, and that signal is visually identical whether the underlying object cost $50 or $5,000 to make, then someone, somewhere is going to figure out how to sell the signal without the $5,000 price tag attached to it. Let's actually walk through how this plays out, because counterfeiting isn't one single thing. It operates across a spectrum, and understanding the different tiers explains a lot about how this entire shadow industry actually functions. At one end, there's what you might call open counterfeiting, the $60 handbag at the market stall, the obviously fake watch sold off a blanket on a city sidewalk. Nobody involved is confused about what's happening. The buyer knows it's fake, the seller knows it's fake. This tier isn't really selling deception, it's selling the visual signal alone, stripped of any pretense that it's the real thing, to buyers who want the aesthetic without ever intending to pay for or claim the authenticity behind it. In the middle sits a much larger, much more organized tier, goods sophisticated enough that a casual observer genuinely can't tell the difference, sold through channels that create just enough ambiguity for buyers to tell themselves a comfortable story. A listing that never quite says authentic, but shows official-looking photos. A price that's suspiciously good, but not so absurd it triggers obvious alarm. This tier profits specifically from that gray zone of plausible deniability, both for the seller and in an odd way for the buyer, who often gets to enjoy the signal while maintaining just enough uncertainty to avoid feeling like they knowingly bought something fake. And at the far end, there's what the industry has started calling superfakes, counterfeits so precise, down to matching serial numbers, authentication cards, and even the packaging's internal codes, that they can fool trained experts and sometimes even the brand's own authentication systems. This tier isn't selling a discount signal anymore. It's committing straightforward fraud, often at prices close to the real thing. banking on the fact that verification has become a genuine arms race between counterfeiters and brands, each side constantly upgrading their methods in response to the other. Now here's a piece of this that gets far less attention than the fashion angle, and it's the part that actually matters most from a practical standpoint. Counterfeiting isn't limited to handbags and watches, and outside of luxury goods, the stakes look completely different. Counterfeit pharmaceuticals are a well-documented serious global problem. Medications that may contain the wrong dose, no active ingredient at all, or genuinely dangerous contaminants, sold through channels that look legitimate enough to fool people who are often simply trying to afford treatment they need. Counterfeit electrical components and car parts create real safety risks, brake pads that don't perform under stress, chargers that skip safety certifications and pose fire risks, safety equipment that looks correct but fails exactly when it's needed. In these categories, the victimless framing that sometimes gets attached to buying a fake handbag falls apart completely because the thing being counterfeited was never really a status signal to begin with. It was a functional promise that this product does what it claims to do safely, and that promise is exactly what gets broken. This is worth separating clearly in your own mind from the fashion and accessory tier because the ethical and practical stakes are genuinely different. A fake handbag is mostly an intellectual property and consumer honesty question. A fake brake pad or a fake medication is a safety question, and treating both categories with the same casual shrug misses something that actually matters. Here's the turning point, and it's the piece that reframes this whole topic for me. Counterfeiting isn't really a story about criminals exploiting an otherwise honest market. It's a story about a huge portion of the legitimate market already selling something intangible, status, exclusivity, a story about who you are at an enormous markup over the material cost underneath it. Counterfeiters didn't invent that dynamic. They just found a way to sell a thinner, cheaper version of the same signal to people the original pricing structure was never designed to include. That doesn't make counterfeiting harmless, and it definitely doesn't make it legal, but it does explain why it persists at such enormous scale, despite decades of enforcement effort, billions of dollars in anti-counterfeiting technology, and constant legal action. As long as a meaningful part of what a luxury price tag is selling is a signal rather than a material difference, there will be an economic incentive to sell that same signal more cheaply, and someone will keep finding a way to do it. This connects to something we've circled back to throughout this whole series. Price so often tells a story that has very little to do with the physical thing changing hands. We've seen it with risk premiums, with manufactured scarcity, with the gap between what something costs to make and what people are actually willing to pay for what it represents. Counterfeiting is just the version of that story where an entire shadow industry decided to sell the story alone without bothering to include the object it was originally attached to. So what's actually useful here in your own life next time you're evaluating a purchase? The most important thing, by a wide margin, is separating the safety-critical categories from the purely aesthetic ones in your own thinking. If you're buying medication, electrical goods, car parts, or safety equipment, sourcing from verified, legitimate retailers isn't optional caution, it's the entire point, because the risk in these categories is genuinely physical, not just financial or ethical. A steep discount on something meant to keep you safe is one of the clearest red flags worth taking seriously, every time, without exception. For purely aesthetic goods, it's worth getting honest with yourself about what you're actually buying when you pay a luxury price, and deciding deliberately how much of that price you're genuinely willing to pay for the signal itself versus the material object underneath it. Neither answer is wrong, but making that choice consciously, rather than on autopilot, tends to lead to spending that actually matches what you value, instead of spending shaped entirely by a story you never stop to examine.
And if you're ever making a significant purchase where authenticity genuinely matters, whether that's a watch, a designer piece, or anything else in that super fake vulnerable tier, it's worth knowing that third-party authentication services exist specifically for this reason, and using one is a small, sensible cost relative to the risk of an expensive, sophisticated fake.
What stays with me most about this topic is how much it reveals about the legitimate marketed shadowing. Counterfeiters are, in their own strange way, some of the most attentive students of consumer psychology operating anywhere in the world economy, because their entire business model depends on correctly identifying exactly which part of a product's price is really about the object and which part is about something else entirely. That's genuinely useful to sit with, even if you never come anywhere near a counterfeit good in your life, because the same question applies to nearly everything you buy that carries a brand name, a story, or a status attached to it. What part of this price is the object and what part is the story? Neither is a fake question to ask, and neither answer makes you foolish for having paid it. But knowing which one you're actually spending your money on tends to make every purchase after that a little more honest, a little more deliberate, and a little less shaped by a signal you never chose to buy into on purpose. Progress beats perfection here too. You don't need to become an authentication expert or interrogate every purchase you make. You just need to remember the next time a price feels like it's selling you more than the object in front of you, that the gap between those two things is exactly where this whole industry lives.